Yeah, Dr.
Shall
Kailash, I think we can start. Yes.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, yes.
Okay. So can I start the session?
Yes, yes.
Okay, okay. Thank you. Okay. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the session on Smart and Intelligent Microscopy Clinical Applications by Dr. Renu John. I'm A.B. Kurian, and I will be the host of this webinar. Dr. Renu John is currently the professor in biomedical engineering at Indian Institute of Technology, Hyderabad. Dr. Renu John is the founder director and head of the Center for Healthcare Entrepreneurship that focuses on innovation in medical devices. He also chairs the Center for Interdisciplinary Program at IIT Hyderabad. He completed his master's in physics from Department of Physics, CUSAT, Kerala, followed by his doctoral studies in optics in Indian Institute of Technology, Delhi. Dr. John has been a postdoctoral research associate at Fitzpatrick Center for Photonics, Duke University, Durham, USA, and Beckman Institute of Advanced Science and Technology, University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, over 5 years before he joined IIT Hyderabad as a faculty in biomedical engineering. His research interests include coherence and low coherence imaging and microscopy, molecular imaging, nanoscopy, quantitative phase microscopy, and point-of-care diagnostics and lab-on-chip biosensors. Note to the audience, during the talk, if you have any queries or questions, please post it in the chat box. After this session, Sir will address these questions. So without further ado, I now invite Dr. Renu John to officially commence the session we have all been waiting for. On to you, sir.
Right, thanks, Emil. Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much, Professor Kailasnath and Dr. Suresh Nair for this invitation. And so it's always a pleasure back home to be at CUSAT. I was part of that. I still believe that I'm part of that institute. So I will go a little bit overview of clinical applications in of microscopy, and then we can have a discussion session. I think that makes better sense for the student community as well. So again, thanks to Professor Kailasnath for organizing this student chapter. All of you can see my screen, right?
Yes, sir.
Can you? Yeah, and
Yes,
I'm audible, right?
Yes,
Yes.
sir. You're audible.
Right. So I think we'll get started with microscopy, and then we can move on to the discussions. So today's talk, I will be talking a little bit more about optical microscopy, then a little bit in detail about how do we do image in 3 dimensions or depth and the phase of the images, especially with related to biological cells and live cells. And then I will wrap up with the recent developments of how do we use AI and machine learning applications in microscopy for various diagnostic applications. So typically, when we talk about a regular optical microscope that is used in clinic, so all what you see here is sort of like a faded image, which is fairly transparent about for the cells. We don't see much of details unless we go on to something like staining the cells. So putting some stains so that they can be visible. Each of the subcellular organelles can be visible by staining. And in most of the clinical applications, there are 2 applications that we focus on. One is histopathology, where we take a small section of the tissue, fix it, stain it, and load under the microscope and view it. That is what see here. And the second application is when we really do something called a cytology, which could be like a smearing of some portion of some cells from the body. which are also live cells, and then they are fixed with ethanol or formalin, and then again you use the staining agents and load under a microscope to visualize the cells. And for most of the applications, what people are interested in diagnostics, like from a tissue, you want to look at biopsy tissue to find out whether there is a cancer or some malignancy associated with the cells or the type of malignancy. In the case of cytology, again, the applications like, say, cervical pap smear or an oral cytology where we brush out few cells and look it under the microscope. We are essentially looking at how the cells and how the condition of the cells, what is the type, structure, morphology, are they dividing, are they actively dividing? Some of the features which clearly show the signatures of a cancer and similar things. Apart from that, probably microscopy might be used heavily in stained applications like fluorescence microscopy. So today's talk, I was mostly concentrating on live cells with as much as possible as it is live without any processing or any addition of dyes. So, and the whole aim would be like, how do we study the cells in 3 dimensions? How do you see their dynamics in time? And how can we use them for diagnostic applications? So when it comes to live cells without staining or anything, they are fairly transparent and you don't see much of details in the cells unless you really put some stains or contrast agents. The fact is that the moment you put contrast agents, they become like no more viable or living cells. So majority of the stains that are used in clinics are toxic in nature. So the whole concept of live cell imaging is not applicable when it comes to staining. So that is one of the reasons why when we talk about live cell imaging, we are not really able to image the details of the cells what we really want to see unless you fix them and stain it. So one of the techniques which is very popular in imaging live cells is what we call as a phase contrast, where when we talk about a cell which is fairly transparent, it is like a glass which is transparent. Only change that the cell creates in the light passing through is the phase change or the change because of the change in the refractive index of the cell. So it won't create much of amplitude contrast, but whereas it actually modulates the phase of the light that is passing. You can see in the image. So you can see that as the light passes through this refractive index, difference in refractive index, it just modulated in phase. So how do we really visualize this phase? So as you know, I mean, all our detectors, which are square law detectors, they don't really record the phase change. Anything which we write as e to the power of I5, which is a phase, cannot be detected by a square law detector, and we detect only the amplitude or intensity, which is mode square. So the phase is lost there. So how can we visualize this phase is one of the main questions in live cell imaging. So we will talk a little bit about how we can visualize thickness or phase, and there are a lot of methods which are fairly popular in live cell imaging applications, like interferometry, which most of the interferometry techniques are basically coming from the principle of interferometry or coherence interferometry, and slowly into partial coherence or log coherence interferometry. So most of these techniques are, based on the principle of coherence or log coherence. There are also techniques like something we call as transport of intensity, where we can really move away from coherence, but we can study the propagation of light intensity along the z or the depth direction, and multiple recordings can really give out or bring out the phase, how the phase propagates. There are also some classes of interferometry techniques where we can really reconstruct the phase with the help of a single recording. So holographic microscopy is one of those which I would talk about today. So if you look at the basic principle of holography, it is very simple. You have two beams which are coherent in nature. They interfere, creating the fringes like this. If you can cut off one beam and illuminate the grating or the fringe that is formed with the other beam, it would reconstruct the original beam. So if you have two beams, the object and the other beam as a reference, and the reference and the object beam coherently add each other, resulting in what we call as a hologram. So you can see that in this reconstruction, when we reconstruct this recorded hologram, which I noted as I, with the same reference beam, then it would reconstruct two terms basically. So we have the object and the conjugate of the object, which these two terms are mostly called the twin images, the object and its conjugate beam. Okay, so this is sort of the basic principle of holography proposed by Geber in the 40s. The holographic principle or holographic microscopy is essentially based on this. We have a Mach center or a Mach center interferometer typically, and the two beams interfere. One of the beams is passing through the sample, and the other beam is the reference beam, and they interfere together at the camera. And so now, instead of a regular holographic film or a recording film, we use a digital camera. So the intensity recording happens on a digital camera, and the data is no more on the recorded film, but it's on a digital sensor, which is nothing but a CMOS array. So now your hologram is a digital hologram in your computer. You don't need to have a reference beam now. So actually you need to have a reference beam on your computer. So the digital reference beam, which you know already, which can be coded onto your software, can multiply with the recorded digital hologram and reconstruct the original object. So that is what happens in a digital holographic image. So the basic principle is that, say you know the hologram, you have the hologram that is recorded on your camera, and while reconstruction, you are essentially propagating the waveform, the object waveform, with the help of what we call as the diffraction theory. So we use the Fresnel kernel or the Fraunhofer kernel, which is used for wave propagation, and propagate it to the object image plane, where we can reconstruct the object back. So I don't want to go detail into these equations, but it is nothing but, say you can really look at these equations. So I is the recorded hologram multiplied by the reference beam, and this is nothing but the Fresnel kernel or the Fraunhofer kernel. Depending on the scale factor, you can propagate it over a distance and reconstruct the object back. So this is a very good example of how do we record such a hologram. So we have the object beam and the reference beam creating a hologram. And when so you can see that in this particular image, in the second image, you can see three terms. So essentially the three terms are what you see in the equation above in the hologram. So you have the R mode square, the O mode square, which is nothing but the DC or the background intensity, which is, both of them are intensity terms. And there are two terms, R O star and R star O. Star represents the conjugate. So these are the other two terms. So if you take any one of these terms, you can reconstruct the object information back. So that is the beauty of holography. So the only problem here is that, suppose you have a camera of this size, you know, the actual information that you're recording is only very small. So the rest of the useful sensor area that you have is being wasted for recording the other terms, which you really don't need. So this is one of the basic problems of what we call as an off-axis hologram, because you have the object and the reference beam at an angle, and then it would result in three different beams, three different terms, and you are essentially sacrificing the space bandwidth product of your system. Anyway, irrespective of that, you can really take out that one of the terms and reconstruct the amplitude and phase of the object back. Okay. So when it comes to microscopy, the only change that you introduce here is that you put a microscope objective. Depending on the magnification of the MO, you can get as much big as you need. So the magnification decides how big you can magnify the system, and usually you can use any standard MOS with your microscope. But the problem is that, so as you go higher in magnification, the microscope objective also introduce aberrations in the system. So usually when we go for very high magnifications, the aberrations also are huge. So the beauty of the digital holography is that you have the waveform on your computer, and if you know that you're recording a beam with some amount of wavefront curvature or some aberrations, you can actually code that into your reconstruction. So you can code a phase term depending on what aberrations do you have, and a conjugate of that phase terms can be multiplied with the reconstruction so that you can nullify the phase aberrations that are present in the system. So if you really have a background image without an object, you can quantify the aberrations that are present in the system, and whenever you use the system for imaging, you can always use a conjugate of that background aberrations in the system so that you can create a aberration free image anytime you want with the help of digital holography. Right. So I would just post a few applications what we did with the help of digital holographic microscopy. So one of the applications we are looking at microfluidic channels for various biosensing applications. So you can see in the first top corner, you have this hologram, which is a microfluidic channel. So you hardly see the hologram, but the interference and the recorded terms are all in the hologram. And now we sort of multiply with the reference beam, and I have the phase aberrations already coded here. So what I do is that I take a conjugate of that, which is shown below, multiply with the reference beam, so that it can nullify the aberrations already present. So in addition, so how do I calculate this? So if you look at the microfluidic channels, there are spaces where the object is not present. So I use those rectangular areas where the object is not there to quantify the phase aberrations in the system. And I find the phase aberrations and take a conjugate of it and multiply with the reconstructed object so that it just subtracts out the phase aberrations. The entire process is fairly simple, but when you reconstruct it, you can really see that what you see is not the depth and thickness, but in your holographic reconstruction, you can really see the thickness and the grooves and all very clearly. So I think, yeah. So I have a video of the channel here, so which is reconstructed. So the beauty of hologram is that you can really see in all different directions the amplitude, depth, and thickness of everything. So what you see in the small window is the actual image of the channel under a regular microscope, which has maybe 10x or 20x magnification. And what you see in the holographic reconstruction is the channel in its three-dimensional look. The depth of the channel is about 45 micron and the width is about 100 micron. So you can really reconstruct the depth and the thickness of any object which normally doesn't look like that in a regular microscope. So we sort of looked at various properties and refined our system. So whenever there are edges, we also see that there is a problem, what we call as a phase wrapping. So we don't get this steep jumps in phases at the edges. So we have to use something called phase unwrapping algorithms, where we can get a nice jump of phase at the edges. So all of these are, well reported. It's already available. So we can really use the algorithms for phase unwrapping and reconstruct a perfect phase of the object back. So we went down a little bit further to see what are the upper limits that we can do. So what you can see here is probably so on the left top corner, you can see small electrodes which are nanometric thickness. So typically, like, these are under 200 nanometers, and we could really look at these electrodes, which are fairly transparent. So they are not visible under the microscope. You can only see very narrow edges of this nanometric thick electrodes, and then a holographic image of those electrodes would really give you that thickness, which is like about 167 nanometer thick and about 95 or 100 micron wide. So you can really see that the depth and thickness of the electrodes are very clear in the holographic microscope. And I also did something where we really integrated the electrodes on a microfluidic chip. And this is actually a biosensor chip for detection of cholesterol. So right away looked with the help of a microscope, with the help of a holographic microscope under the optic. So you could really resolve the depth of the channel, which is about 100 micron. And below that, you have these electrodes, which are about 160 nanometer thick. So the range of resolution that you can get scales from few tenths of nanometer to a scale of 100 microns. So this is the resolution that you can get in a holographic microscope along the depth direction. Of course, you can right away ask what is the spatial resolution. So as in the case of any microscope, the spatial resolution is decided by the pixel size of the camera. So if a camera can resolve few microns, you can 5 microns pixels can resolve the same. It can give the same spatial resolution. Right. So are there any questions, or somebody was? All right. So we'll move ahead, and we can come to questions later. So we also looked at flows through the microfluidic channel. So we have put flows through the microfluid channel. We could really find that even if the fluid was fairly transparent, this was, I think, water or glycerine with a different thickness flowing through the microfluidic channel, you could really see how the fluid flows in and out of the channel with the help of holographic microscope. So we showed that we can really do static imaging as well as do flows, and also we tried putting biological objects like bacteria. So this is E. coli. E. coli typically have about nanometer thickness, a few hundreds of nanometer thickness. And so you can see a dividing phase of an E. coli image through a holographic microscope. These are a bunch of yeast cells which are quite fast dividing. So you can see the division of yeast cells right away under the microscope. You can see them dividing and separating out and growing. So we can really do the 3D tomography of the cells with its depth and thickness, and we could observe the live dynamic events, and we also looked them flowing. So a lot of things can be done on cells while flowing, like the type of flow cytometry data, which can be really looked at in 3 dimensions with the help of holographic microscope. So the advantage what we have really is that the object of your interest you can image in 3 dimensions in its depth and thickness, which would carry much more value than what you see under a regular microscope. And all of these things we can do in real time. We can do when the cells are live without having to stain or fix them. All right. So we sort of started looking at what are the applications that we could use this technology for. So what directly came to us was the standard cytology. So the 2 cases which we explored, one was oral cytology, where we use a brush cytology, where you use a small brush to scrap off few cells from the oral cavity, and these cells go under a microscope. These cells are normally fixed, stained, and go under a microscope for suspicious lesions in the case of oral cavity. The other application is what we call as a cervical pap smear, which is one of the standards used for screening for cervical cancer in women above 40. So all is done is that we have a small tool which scrap off few cells from the face of the cervix, which goes again, and after fixing and staining, they go under a microscope where they look at the cells for changes in structural morphology for anomalies. So we did the same exercise with the help of a holographic microscope. So typically what we see is this. So you can see the cells stained and fixed and stained and loaded onto a microscopic slide regularly. So in the case of holographic microscope, this is what we see. So we can see a exfoliate cytology cell from the oral cavity. you can really see the prominent nuclei and the cytoplasm and its thickness and everything. So why this is important? Because these are unstained cells, not fixed and live, where they are not processed in any way. Right away from the scrapping of the cells from the oral cavity, you just smear it onto a slide and down under the microscope and image it. So as you can see very clearly, you can see the prominent nuclei of the cell. And how it is important is that typically in the case of a cancer cell or a precancerous cells, there is a lot of nuclear activity or the division of the nucleus. So those type of cells which are precancerous in nature will have a lot of nuclear content, because the nucleus, the cytoplasm is dividing and the nucleus starts dividing first. So those type of cells are either having a high nuclear content, or they might be multinucleate, or even having a lot of nuclear content which gets them into dividing. So any typical smear under a microscope, what you can see here is a lot of cells with single nuclei. But in the case of an anomalous or an abnormal case, you would see a lot of cells with multinucleus or a heavy content of nucleus. So if you really see the phase image in a holographic microscope, you can see the prominent nucleus. So typically what the clinic estimates is they do what we call as a nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio, which is an aerial ratio, which sort of decides whether the cells are closer to normal or on the other side, whether they are more prone to nuclear divisions. So they do an average of multiple cells and find out this nuclear to cytoplasmic ratio. So here in the case of holography, we can do the same thing, but not a aerial ratio, but a volume ratio, which will be much more accurate. So I have some of the images where we looked at cells. So this is again like a nucleus in this whole area of cytoplasm. You can quantify the volume of the cytoplasm as well as the volume of the nuclear content. So these are some of the examples where we did the volume oral cytology using the holographic microscope and compared parallelly with the regular process of Chinese staining. So I'm skipping all those things because we all of these we analyzed for a large number of cases to find out nuclear to cytoplasmic ratios of areas and volume and compared with the results later on. So we could get a set of parameters which really point to the malignancy or the normality of the cells. So these are some of the examples which were actually proved to be precancerous or cancerous in nature after the biopsy procedure. So you can really see how the nuclear content is high in these cells. So these are no more a normal, what we call as a normal cell, because the nuclear content is pretty high. So they are occupying almost more than 50% of the cytoplasm. So it's quite easy to diagnose. So it's quite easy to look at these volumes and diagnose whether you can really find out there are suspicious regions or not. So I will move to so the basic problem what we talked about in the case of off-axis, or when we have a reference beam and object beam at an angle, is that you have the three terms which I talked about, the object beam and the conjugate of the object beam. So, and they are going to take a large area on the detector, so which would sacrifice your sensor area. So, so if you really reduce this angle of the reference beam so that the object beam and the reference beam almost come very closer or at 0 degree between them. So we can record what we call as on-axis or inline holograms. So in fact, the first hologram which was recorded by Gaver to show the theory of holography was an inline hologram, which is where the reference and the object had 0 degree. And what happens is that, you know, all these three terms now overlap each other. So you cannot, when we reconstruct, you have the object along with its conjugate of the object almost overlapping. So if you have a sharp focus on the object, you will have a blurry conjugate of the object almost overlapping on it, if the angle is very low or 0. So this is what we call as the twin image problem in on-axis holography. So now we can actually enhance the power of your algorithm. So we can, with the advances in what we call as regularizations or optimizations in holography, you can treat the hologram as a sparse object. Of course, hologram itself is sparse by definition, and you can see that, if you even if we have the two terms, which is the object and its conjugate almost overlapping, you can use optimization algorithms, which are nonlinear optimization algorithm, and deconvolve these two terms so that you can really get object beam out. So basically you save your sensor area at the cost of your computation. So it won't be like single shot reconstruction. You would have an algorithm which works on behind, but with the GPU architectures, we can almost have real time or live reconstructions with the help of algorithms. Yeah. So I won't go into the details of it again. So basically what is done is that it's an iterative process of reconstruction, where what we do is that we define a cost function. The cost function is nothing but the difference between the actual recorded hologram and the ideal hologram. So we know what is the actual recorded hologram, and we know the other terms. So we take a difference between them, and that would be a cost function. And our iterative procedure, what it will do is that we try to optimize this cost function, minimize this cost function. So any expectation maximization algorithm is used for minimizing this cost function. And in addition to this, we can also have some parameters which normally we call it as a penalty factor. So we can add a beta there, which would sort of tweak in our optimization algorithm so that we get the best results out of it. So in principle, we can really have a constrained we can have a constrained optimization onto the reconstruction, so that we can retrieve the object information which is overlapping in nature. So we have some prior information also, because you know that it is a conjugate of the object. So you have a prior information, and you know what is the ideal value. So we can always take a reconstruction with the help of an optimization procedure. So this was one of the ways in which we could really come up with reduction in the complexity of the geometry for recording. And another way people have looked at is how can we really go for much more simpler geometries without lenses and without two beams coming in. So we call this as inline holograms, or even lensless holograms, where you have just a point source, which could be a tip of a fiber which is emitting the light, and you keep the object as close to the detector as possible. In most of the time, the cover slip is nothing but the outer cover of your camera itself. So if you have a camera like on your mobile phone, which is the detector, so there won't be any lenses. You have a cover slip on the detector array, which is going to which is going to hold the object, and the light beam, which is diverging in nature, passes through the object and fall onto the camera. So the object and the reference beams are nothing but the same beam itself. So those beams which are traveling through the slide without scattering, or the unscattered beams, act as the reference beam, and those beams which are scattered by the thickness of the object is the object information. So both of them travel and record onto the detector, which are kept very close, few millimeters, and we can record the hologram right away there. So this is an example of a red blood cell recorded. It's a hologram. Actually, it is not actually a shadow of the RBC. Most of the time, people relate a hologram with a shadogram here, but this is actually an interference pattern. We have verified it multiple times now, how we can create an interferogram with the help of like a lensless geometry. So we do have an interference pattern of the object and the unscattered light that is passing around the object, and we can record a hologram and we can reconstruct it. So this is a red blood cell, and we have reconstructed the RBC also right away there. So typical sizes are like 2 to 5 microns, and in fact, I don't have the results here, but we have even looked at the membrane fluctuations of RBC, which are like nanometric displacements of the RBC membrane. So we can really go to that level of accuracy where we can quantify the nanometric fluctuations of oscillations on the surface of the RBC using this geometry. So that was at another configuration. So we explored, can we record inline holograms without much of complexity of the system? Then can we go for lensless systems where we can have a very compact system, almost like your mobile phone, to record holograms in real time? And we also tried something called a transport of intensity. So this is a very interesting equation. So where you really don't need a coherent source like a laser. So you can really look at a low coherent source or even an LED with a pinhole on it, so that we create a partially coherent system, which is very cheap. You don't really have to invest on expensive lasers for this. So this is what typically called as a transport of intensity equation. Actually, this is the history of this equation is very interesting. So this was originally proposed for recording of X-rays or in X-ray shadowgrams. So they people used incoherent or low coherent X-rays for recording shadowgrams in X-rays, which is nothing but our regular X-rays, and started looking at, can we reconstruct the thickness or the phase information in X-ray with the help of this intensity equations. So the whole principle, what it says is that if you know the gradient of the intensity in the Z or the depth direction, you can get the phase of it. So the equation looks very complicated, but the phase is proportional to the Z gradient of the intensity is what it means. So you can right away invert this equation and you can get the phase out of it. All you need to know is the dou by dou Z of the intensity. So if you can record, so when you say that the gradient of or derivative of intensity with respect to Z direction, you can take a set of images in the depth direction. So it is essentially defocusing the image. So if you can have a sharp focus at one plane and a set of images which are defocused in nature, you plug it into this equation step by step and you can reconstruct the phase. So basically, when we talk about imaging with a sharp focus in the normal intensity cases, here we are doing imaging with defocus, and a set of defocused images can give you the thickness of it. So I don't go through the equations again. It's fairly simple substitutions, but mathematically or theoretically, you are inverting the equation to get the phase. Practically, what you are doing is that you can take three images, one which is a sharp focus and one defocus in the upper plane and one defocus in the lower plane. So two defocus images and one sharp focus image. You can take the difference in intensities to create the gradient. And so these are examples of phase mapping done with the help of transparent spherical beads. So these are spherical beads for floating in water. And we did three images, one sharp focus and two defocus images, and you could really get the 3D phase thickness of the spheres. So the main drawback is that you have to take three images here. It is not a single snapshot. So if you really want to observe live events which are faster in nature, this may not be a good solution. So there has been a lot of work also done where people try to look at single image and etc. But I don't go into those details. But so we looked at cells which are growing. So these are fiber HUX cells, and we reconstructed the amplitude, thickness, and even you could some of these images you could really see the cellular features also right away in the images with the help of the phase microscope. So we sort of explored these three ideas. In fact, one was the lensless holography, the second one was the inline hologram, and the third one was the transport of intensity. And we found that in all of these cases, we could really use a LED, which is like few rupees, and we can put pinholes so that we can create some amount of coherence. And say, for example, if you use a 300 micron pinhole in front of an LED, that is good enough to get even a coherent a partially coherent hologram recorded for the object. So for microscopy, the area of the object is really small. So for such small regions, these sources could really work as coherent sources. So we could really assemble this system, which is a microscope, which has probably much more features than the expensive microscopes and confocal microscopes that you see in clinics now. So these one of the problems that we really want to look here is to look at in applications of in vitro fertilizations. So typically in IVF applications, every IVF clinic, they'll have to look at they have to characterize the semen or the sperms. The spermatozoas are like they are extracted, they are stained, fixed and stained and loaded under a microscope to look at anomalies in the sperms. So what we found in literature is there are about 80 classes of anomalies of human sperms, which make them not useful for fertilization, or we call them as infertile sperms. So almost like 80 classes of different anomalies present. So, and all of these can be isolated only by a pathologist who sit under the microscope and go through all these slides. And typically, even for a one case, for one patient, they may have to do this characterization of sperms multiple times before they can arrive at a conclusion of how fertile these sperms are. So this is a very long and laborious process. And we thought, why don't we try doing a holographic microscope with this technology? And so we right away looked at the sample without any fixing and staining, and this is exactly what we saw. So when we showed this to an IVF expert, he was almost like amazed, because actually in any practical procedure where he uses this sperm for in vitro fertilization on an embryo, on an ovum, he don't see even 1/10 of the features that we see under this microscope. So basically, you can see the nucleus, very clear nucleus in the head of the sperm, and the front portion of the sperm, which is also very important. So the acrosomal region of the sperm has a lot of vacuoles and all. So there's a lot of scientific literature which shows that a heavily vacuolated sperm head is not a viable sperm, and also a very poorly vacuolated sperm is also not a viable sperm. And if you look at the middle region, which we call as the centrosomal region of the sperm, right after the nucleus, so there are a lot of anomalies present in the centrosomal region, like minor inflammations which are hardly noticed under a regular microscope. So if the acrosomal region, what you see here now, if there is a small inflammation in this region, that clearly indicates that there are some of these centrosomal proteins present in the sperm, which actually create some hormones which are really responsible for abortions after the fertilizations. So basically, after the fertilizations, many of these hormones secreted by the centrosomal regions are responsible for the fetus, for the spoiling of the fertilization. So we see a lot of features. If you look closely, you can see a head which is about 5 micron in thickness to at the lowest tail end of the sperm, which is about 100 nanometer thick. So the range at which we could see in a single snapshot was extremely high. So this was our exercise with the human spermatozoa. And so the next step, what I wanted to look at is like how we can introduce intelligence into this type of low cost microscope. So one of the main applications we looked at deep learning or machine learning applications, where we could really use them for classification, use these 3D images or the depth and thickness of these cells for classification into, say, normal and anomalous class of cells, or even like a healthy sperm and a non-unhealthy sperm, things like that. So, and also we also tried looking at, I talked about retrieving the depth information or the thickness. So we also looked at, can we really evoke the principles of physics, because we know that the depth or thickness can be reconstructed with the help of a Fresnel propagating kernel. So because that is what happens, that is what is happening in optics in holography. So we thought if we could intelligently code in some of these features into a network, which is like a convolutional neural network, where some of the layers will be taking care of the phase reconstructions. So can we record intensities and retrieve the phase without having to record a hologram or without having to go for complicated algorithms? So these are the two problems which we concentrated on using machine learning and deep learning algorithms. So in fact, I mean, there has been a lot of debate on can we use machine learning for say for diagnosis. In fact, we are really not looking at replacing a clinician, but if you have an algorithm which could augment a clinician, or if you alleviate the cognitive load on a physician in decision making, whether it could be for image analysis or pattern classification, or it could be for better interpretation of the results. So that is what we looked at in all of these cases. So in all the three cases, basically in the oral cytology application, in the cervical pap smear cases, we could really get amazing results with very high accuracy with very low number of iterations or training. I would show maybe some of the results. So in the case of sperms, we could really look at the quality of the sperms, the specifications and parameters, and then the area, all the area parameters of the sperm, and we could classify them with very high accuracy. So we did the same case for oral cytology and for pap smear applications, and so this was the GAN network which used for reconstruction of phase from a regular hologram without having to do the traditional reconstruction. So this is one work in progress, but we have got very good results, and I think the paper is still under review. So with this, I would sort of wrap this talk. I think I have finished my time already. So thank you very much, and I think the forum is open for questions. Thank you very much. Yep.
You may please ask the questions now.
So we need more students.
Hello, Renu.
Hi, sir.
Yeah, I think I will just start off with a question so that others can also ask. I think the last part of your talk, it's a very recent work which you are proceeding with now, the deep learning activities. Yes.
Yeah.
How well it is you are able to look at these results with the actual things.
So were you talking about the classification or
the machine learning part?
But for classification purposes.
Yes, classification.
Yeah. So basically, we looked at classification of the pap smear with the cervical cancer cells. So we could really get up to 98% accuracy with very low number of samples. We were talking about like maybe as of now we had 17 patients and number of cells probably under 10 to the power of 5. So it was a very low population. When it comes to neural networks, these are very low volume of data. With this, we were able to get about 98% accuracy. I think, I mean, the project is still going on, and maybe a lot of learning has to be there. At the moment, it is in the training phase, but we are getting fairly high accuracies with it. So the second aspect, when we use these GANs for doing a phase reconstruction, that is still a complicated problem. So we are trying, like, all the cases, when can we reconstruct phase from a hologram with the help of learning. It is I think it is not that easy, because we know the physics, we could do it better, but can a machine learning algorithm pick it up in a better way is what something which we are exploring. And then there is a lot of learning exercise to it. I think it take a longer time to explain that. But we are successful, not though fully, because whatever we face in unwrapping, we are facing it here also. So the problem for unwrapping such reconstructed phase is also there.
Yeah, and the question, just a clarification regarding your one of your earlier results is the microfluidic flow that you have designed. Yes.
Yeah.
So how do you actually make it possible under the microscope?
I think it is just actually possible because yeah. So
how do you actually make the microfluidic channel? That's what I was asking.
Yeah. So those are very easy. So we can have we make them on our own. So these are like the polymer channels, which are very very easily possible. So you make one master template and you can make as many channels as possible on PDMS and similar things. So these are very easy. And how we do it on the cells, I don't know whether you can see the background image of the microscope. Actually, this is a commercial Zeiss microscope with a with an incubator attached to it. So the area where it is a glass incubator, where you can load the cells and grow the cells in real time while you do the imaging. So what I did was that, in fact, I used this only for an incubation application, but I was like folding the microscope objective back and shining the laser into it with external optics, and then using the laser to do the imaging part out. So, but you can do it. Microfluidics is very well possible. We have even flown cells into the channels and imaged them. It is very well possible.
Thank you, Dr. Renu.
Yeah, I think if nobody's asking, I can ask a question.
Yeah, I see a lot of students who have joined the meeting. So
yes,
they should be asking. Yeah.
Okay, I will start with one more question. Like you know, the holographic microscopy and all, you have taken the sample and it is under microscope and all. And you normally take out, for example, cervical cancer or oral cancer, you take out the sample and then put it on stained and then you look at. Can this setup be modified so that, you know, it can be portable probe type of thing, so that, you know, can be.
So so the lensless hologram setup that I have shown. So can you see this image?
Yeah.
So this is actually as small as your mobile phone. So you just have a detector array only, and you essentially the blood smear happens right on your camera surface, which is just a glass light sitting on the top of the detector. And you have a light source, which is an LED. The whole thing is slightly bigger than the mobile phone in thickness. So you don't really need big setups for this. So that was the reason why I said, like, you know, how do we go for portable systems rather than complicated lasers and expensive sources? So these microscopes are like, you know, if I tell the actual BOM of these microscopes, people will laugh at it. So I have microscopes which are as cheap as 1,000 rupees to up to 1 crore. So these are like very cheap microscope. So I in fact I automated the stages so that I can do automatic slide scanning here. So I put two stepper motors on it so that it can do a slide scanning. But if you remove that, that was the only expensive thing on this. Otherwise, it is like a microscope objective and an LED, and that's it.
Is it possible? Like, I think it may not be possible, right? Because we don't want to take out the sample in situ. If you want to just look at, now, is it possible?
Yeah. So in situ, we can do sort of like up to 5 micron or 5 to 8 micron. So what I see is that you know, when it comes to tissue level imaging, I would say I would vote a little bit more for OCT than for microscopy, because OCT can really get a 1 millimeter of the exposed tissue. So I actually am getting excellent results with OCT. In fact, I call it as optical coherence microscope. instead of OCT, I call it as OCM compared to these type of holographic microscopes. So I can do a tomographic image about a millimeter on the surface, especially in the oral cavity. So you can have a handheld OCM probe which looks at the surface of the oral cavity, and you can do this. So it is much easier that way rather than taking the smear onto the slides.
Thank you.
I think Suresh sir is more interested if we
Yeah,
can
yeah.
take it to a fiber.
Yeah, so that is the ultimate goal actually. So basically, most of these. So I have one project with the Asian Institute of Gastroenterology, where we want to ultimately put a fiber at the tip of an endoscope. So there are people who have done it, but there are technological challenges from an academic perspective. I don't have scanners as miniaturized as that, which could be loaded at the tip of an endoscope. But I think people like Dr. Suresh can really do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very interesting talk. I think the last portion was something new to me, at least.
Yes, I think there are a lot of work on machine learning now. A lot of microscopy people are slowly moving to the strength of algorithms now. So there are, there is one hospital in Kerala at Kodingalur. So this is called Craft Hospital. You might be aware of it already. So they are one of the best IVF centers in the south. So we are working closely with them on translating this IVF setup to a clinic.
We'll be taking out the job of pathologist, I think.
So
through intelligent, the machine learning and things like that.
So actually, none of the pathologists I met really want to do it because a typical urologist or an IVF expert, they start from the morning and they cannot even get up from their chair. Their entire eyes get strained. It's a whole day process under the binocular microscope, and it's like somebody who is doing it never want to do it actually.
But the whole world is changing towards digital pathology. So I think
yes, yeah.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, participants, you can ask any question.
So students, feel free to write to us, talk to us. So I think we need to get excitement from you because our journey is almost over. You need to take up.
Okay, I think
All right.
No other than probably you can you can always reach Professor Renu John anytime. So okay.
Thank you very much, and once again thank the whole chapter for getting this activity together. So, all right.
Okay.
Thank you, Renu. Thank you, Renu.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe you want to continue?
Yes, sir. Yes, I'm continuing. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, sir. I would like to thank Dr. Renu John for finding his time to give us this informative session amidst his busy schedule. I'd also like to thank Suresh sir, Kailasnath sir, and the BU ma'am for arranging this session. Finally, I would also like to thank the audience for attending this session and making this webinar a huge success. Thank you all for your cooperation.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.